Thank you so much, Vicki. And thank you to the Tampa Bay Library Consortium for having me today. As Vicki mentioned, I'm the director of the Mark Twain Library. You can see him behind me in my virtual background in Redding, Connecticut. But a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is going to be from my time at the Ferguson Library in Stamford, Connecticut. I recently took on my new position just this past June. So the cross training that I did was primarily at my former job. So before we get started, I would first just like to ask everyone to add to the chat what their reason is for being interested in cross training and doing some cross training with their staff. Does no one want to share? Cross training committee for my system. Excellent that you guys have a cross training committee. That's nice that sort of to be meta, you're already cross training by doing it by a committee, which is great. You supervise the circulation teams. We should all know what's going on. Absolutely. Small staff size. We want to provide the best service when one of us is not here. Absolutely. I do find cross training works the best in small buildings or with a small staff because you just really don't have the option to bounce patrons around amongst each other. Okay, great. That gives me a little bit more information as to why you guys are here and what you're interested in. So in November 2014, I started my position as branch manager at the Ferguson Library in Stamford, Connecticut. Stamford is the second largest city in Connecticut and home to 135,000 people. Their library has 3 branches in addition to their central library, as well as a bookmobile. I manage 2 of these branches. I'm primarily going to talk about my experience managing the Harry Bennett branch because it's much larger than the other one I managed. It's 25,000 square feet. This was the building and the team where cross training was really necessary, and I will explain why in a bit. In 2010, following a bad budget year after the economic downturn, there was a draconian cut made to the branch's operating hours. The Harry Bennett branch closed down completely on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When this decision was made, I think everyone thought we would have one bad year and then resume more regular operating hours. Unfortunately, though, once our budget was reduced, it proved impossible to get back up to where we were. The operating hours remained stagnant and the branch remained closed on Tuesdays and Thursdays. As you can imagine, this was a real issue in the community. No one could remember what days we were open. And can you really blame them? I remember coming to visit the branch when I was on maternity leave, and I ended up coming on a day we were closed because even I couldn't remember when we were open. As the years went on, new community members would move in, and they didn't even understand why we weren't open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. After I started managing the branch in 2014, I knew that expanding our operating hours was going to be one of my primary professional goals. While I could not say that cross-training led to more operating hours at first, that was not the case. Instead, I asked 2 staff members who are working in a closed building on Thursdays to instead put in some hours on the floor. I combined this with a $10,000 gift from one of our patrons to expand our hours just a touch. We then opened on Thursdays from 1 to 6. I'm just having trouble advancing my slide for some reason. There we go. Sorry, this is a little blurry picture, but this was us celebrating opening on Thursdays from 1 to 6 with our mayor, who is the man standing there on the right. We were so excited to add another day to our operating hours, but it still did not solve the problem of our hours really not being uniform. This made it very difficult for our patrons to keep track of when we were open. Every year, we would ask the city for enough funding to restore those hours, And every year the city would give us a nominal increase, but it was never enough to get back up to where we were before 2010. Year after year, it became more and more apparent that we would have to expand our hours some other way. Enter cross-training. Now, to give you some background on the Ferguson Library, this is not a picture of the library, by the way. It's a unionized library with a large staff, and prior to Alice Knatt becoming its CEO in 2014, it did not have a reputation for adapting very well to change. The staff structure was very hierarchical, and job descriptions were very rigid. To give you an example, if a patron called the reference desk and asked to renew a book, they were transferred to the circulation desk. Reference librarians were never trained in how to renew a book for a patron. If a patron asked someone at the circulation desk for information on how to use Overdrive or downloadable media, they were asked to turn around and walk behind them to the reference desk that they had passed on their way in. Each desk was really its own silo, and there was very little overlap. Job descriptions and responsibilities were rigid. When the idea of cross-training came up, I had two reservations. The first was that I was afraid our reference librarians would see themselves as above this level of transactional work. This was something that had been ingrained in them for years under old school leadership. I did have a staff member tell me once that the former library president had seen her putting a book back on the shelf and told her she was paid too much to shelve books and should leave that work to our pages. Many Ferguson Library staff members have been with the institution for decades, including this staff member, so a cultural shift was necessary. The other reservation I had was whether it was fair to ask our lower paid library clerks to do work that was historically reserved for a librarian. Is it fair to ask our clerks to answer readers' advisory questions that were normally answered by a librarian for less pay? I will explain in a little bit how both of these worries and reservations flew out the window once we started cross-training by fire. The next part of my story will be familiar to all of you. On March 13th, 2020, we announced that the library would be closed to the public for the next 2 weeks in order to flatten the curve. Remember that? We went home Friday afternoon with the expectation that we would be returning Monday and working inside a closed library. Monday morning came and we reported to work. By lunchtime, we were all sent home. This is a photo. I'm so happy I took this because it was like we were all scrambling to get out of there thinking the virus was like coming at us. But this is a photo of our express bookshelf right before we closed on March 13th, 2020. Like lots of libraries across the country, we didn't really give much advance notice to our patrons about us closing because we were trying our best to stay open. So patrons kind of came in at the end of the day in like a mad dash. It was sort of like supermarket sweep, like trying to grab as many books as possible before we closed. I remember stopping at the grocery store on my way home to grab things for meals for the next few days. Felt a bit like the night before a snowstorm, or since you're all in Florida, a hurricane. There was a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in the air. What followed was what felt like a complete shutdown of society. I won't go into too much detail since we all experienced it, but my husband, baby, and I didn't leave the environs of our little neighborhood for the entire season of spring. My work from home situation was a mix of regular meetings with our leadership team, our entire staff at large, and my own branch staff. I also hosted virtual programs, partnered with some local organizations doing COVID relief and homework help, and tried to sink my teeth into webinars and other online professional development opportunities. It was a deeply strange time. We spent a lot of time baking bread, going for walks as a family, and tie-dyeing. On June 15th, 2020, after getting input from the entire staff on what precautions we would need to have in place in order for them to feel safe at work again, we went back to the library to offer curbside service while still remaining closed to the public. At this point, I had finagled staff schedules so that my staff were operating in 2 teams. One team would work in the building one week and then work at home the following week, and they'd alternate with the other team. This was for social distancing purposes, but it was also to keep one team healthy in case another team had a member exposed to COVID. The first week that we reopened for curbside service was incredibly rewarding. I'm going to read you exactly what I wrote in my journal at the end of that week. Oops, I did not mean to. We started curbside pickup at the library this past Monday. It was the hardest I have worked since maybe Hurricane Sandy. Our team was on their feet from before we opened until after we closed, pulling books, checking in the book drop, dropping books into patrons' trunks, and answering calls. It was incredible to see. No job descriptions, just a team of colleagues working their hardest to be there safely for the community as we circulated 1,000 items. I'm so incredibly proud and grateful to work with them. Also, I was so discombobulated at one point that I spent several minutes trying to open someone's locked trunk, only to find they were not here for curbside pickup. They were just a normal person in our parking lot. At the end of each workday, we would gather as a group and talk about what had worked that day and what hadn't. Curbside pickup was a completely new service for us. It involved preparing holds for pickup and putting them into patrons' cars from start to finish. Some of our reference librarians were diving into tasks they had never been asked to do before, like looking for books on our send or pull list or canceling expired holds. At the same time, our circulation clerks also found themselves taking on new tasks, walking books out to patrons waiting in their car. We learned a lot each day and made frequent adjustments to how we provided service. For example, when we first offered curbside, we allowed up to 30 people to reserve the first time slot of the day. This caused a problem as we would have a bottleneck of cars in our parking lot at 10, and our lone phone line could not handle the influx of calls from patrons telling us they were here. So we recalibrated. After a few weeks of providing curbside service, we decided to take another step toward normalcy and open our doors to the public. This was actually a real opportunity for us because, like many things with COVID, everything had been flipped upside down and on its head. So we had the option of changing our operating hours. Now, normally when it comes to adding hours or services, I'm in favor of starting small. It's much easier to add more hours or staff later than it is to cut hours or cut staff, which are of course things that no one ever wants to do. So when we reopened, we changed our operating hours to Monday through Friday from 10 to 5 and Saturdays 10 to 2. We would no longer be open evenings, and this reduced our Saturday hours. I knew we would need some evenings eventually and that folks would probably complain about Saturday, but I wanted to be open 6 days a week, and I knew there was no way we were going back. We started small. This was also, if you remember, a time when a lot of people were working from home. So what we found was that coming and picking up books, whether they did curbside or walked into the library, people were actually able to do it during business hours because they were working from their homes. So we were hoping that these hours would at least be satisfying to them in the beginning. And you know what happened? The community was so happy that we were even open that we didn't hear any complaints about no longer having evenings and having a shortened Saturday. And like many libraries across the country, business was slow. This provided yet another opportunity for us to rethink how we provided service. So now I'm going to invite you all in the chat to add, if you can think of one positive thing that happened at your library or with your colleagues as a result of the pandemic, if you can please share it in the chat, because the pandemic has been so terrible and devastating to so many people. Sometimes it's nice to be like, well, at least that one little positive thing happened. Gave us lots of time to work on inventory. Absolutely. I've never gotten so much weeding done than when we were closed to the public. Give us time to do a major weeding project, yes. I don't know about you guys. I personally love weeding, but it always ends up being a low priority. It's like something I always figure I'll do at the end of the day when I need sort of a repetitive task. But that's, I need to rethink that, because it means that I end up never getting to it, which isn't good either. They were so pleased when we opened up again and vocal to us and to the community about library service. Yes. We, for a long time, I want to say at least 6 months, probably longer, people would constantly call us just to check if we were open. And they couldn't believe that we were open. They really didn't expect it. So you're right. It's like being open felt like the most basic service to offer them, but it actually delighted and surprised people so much that it was really worth it. Yes, someone's saying they still do. They do still call to check to make sure we're open. Because, you know, lots of places sadly haven't reopened, whether it's given, we have a children's museum in our area that has not reopened yet, which we're all kind of like, is it going to reopen? And then, as you know, there's lots of businesses, restaurants that never ended up reopening, which is a shame as well. Okay. We had gained a lot of momentum with our teamwork and figuring out how to offer service in new and creative ways during our curbside period. I really didn't want to lose that. The pandemic had shaken up our schedules and our routines. I was surprised to find that some staff members who had worked a certain schedule for years were completely open to coming back working a different schedule. If you've ever done schedule with staff, you know the struggle. I think at that point, we were all just so glad to be working and to have our health. So it felt like a good time to shake things up. One way that we did this sounds so simple, yet it really helped from a cross-training perspective. I mentioned earlier that curbside pickup was so popular that our phone on the circulation desk really couldn't handle the influx of calls. So we reprogrammed our phones so that our main number rang at every desk. This meant that if you answered the phone, you might get a curbside question, a question about our hours, a renewal request, or a complicated children's reader's advisory question. This was a boon for our customer service, as patrons stopped getting our voicemail, but it was stressful for staff if they received a question they didn't know how to answer. We had to really rely on both teamwork and managing our patrons' expectations. For example, if a patron called us at 8:30 in the morning and requested 10 picture books about recycling, all of the staff had to be comfortable saying, "Our children's librarian will be pleased to work on this request for you when she is in later today. Would you like a call back when the books are ready?" We found that as long as we acknowledged requests and followed up, patrons were very patient with having to wait a bit if their question was long or complicated. Now you will see here a photo of our couch, not library couch, just my personal couch in my home. So you might be asking yourself, why does she have a slide here with a photo of her couch on it? Well, a few years ago, we had just a regular couch. The ottoman you see here did not exist. We had a coffee table. Then one day, the coffee table broke. We kept meaning to replace it, but we just never ended up having a need for it. So instead, my husband convinced me that we should buy this ottoman. Now, when we push the ottoman up against the couch, it creates something we like to call mega couch. It's basically a couch that takes up most of the room. This is a metaphor for a cross-training concept I like to call mega desk. I know this is not an actual mega desk, but I'll explain why in a second. What you see here is a photo of our information desk on the left and our circulation desk on the right. What you can't tell from the photo, and by the way, the tables are in front of these desks because this was early COVID when we were encouraging social distancing. They no longer have these tables in front of the desk. So what you can't tell from that photo is that these two desks are only a few steps from each other. So remember when I talked about silos before? We would ping pong patrons from desk to desk based on the type of question they asked, reference or circulation. It was not good customer service, and it wasn't great for staff members either, because they didn't like referring the patron to someone else. It felt tedious. It didn't feel like good customer service. So because everything was changing so rapidly and we had already begun the process of cross-training by fire, we made plans to remove our information desk and instead combine our circulation and information desks into one mega desk. What would this look like? The removal of the information desk meant that the staff at the mega desk would handle both circulation and reference questions. It would also mean that rather than being staffed with 2 circulation clerks, it would be staffed by a circulation clerk and a reference librarian. How would the staff feel about this? Remember in the beginning of my presentation when I brought up my 2 reservations, that reference librarians would feel above this type of work and that circulation clerks would feel taken advantage of? Turns out that neither of these things happened. I first started talking about Megadesk in my one-on-one meetings with my full-timers. When they understood the reasoning behind it to increase our operating hours, they seemed to be much more open to the idea, especially because our world at the library had already become so topsy-turvy. Next, I held a staff meeting to talk about Megadesk and to discuss building an entirely new desk that would work better with this new staffing model. It turned out that the biggest concern my staff had was that circulation clerks never felt allowed to answer certain questions because they had been told in the past to save certain work for librarians. The librarians were also happy to learn some of the more transactional parts of library work, like renewing a book or dealing with lost item fees, because it was better customer service. I believe both types of library workers were open to their roles expanding for 2 reasons. The first is that Ferguson Library has spent a long time building a culture of customer service. Rather than being gatekeepers, staff were hired who really want to help patrons. I also made sure to lead by example whenever possible. Staff would see me pushing book carts, refreshing displays, walking curbside holds out to cars, and listening to voicemails every day. I was never going to ask them to do something I wouldn't do. And in fact, I would often do things I would never ask them to do, like picking up dog poop. I wanted them to see that our new normal was a team effort from the top down. So through cross-training, breaking down the siloed desks, and basically flipping everything on its head, I'm proud to say that the Harry Bennett branch now has expanded operating hours. Where'd they go? I lost that slide, but they've expanded operating hours so that they're open 6 days a week, and they now have 2 evenings back a week, and they have expanded their Saturday hours to be from 10 to 5. So we're really just getting back to where they were. And they're currently under the leadership of Denise Lyles, who was a colleague of mine when I was at the Ferguson Library. And she seems to be doing an excellent job and just continuing the rebuilding, metaphorical rebuilding of the branch after COVID and getting back to what our new normal is. So, lessons learned from this exercise. The first would be to communicate well with your staff. One thing I noticed when we were all in quarantine and working from home and trying to find projects that related to our roles, I had asked my full-time staff to each create a how-to manual of the tasks that they did. And that was to prepare us for cross-training. But what I noticed, some of my staff, instead of coming back with a step-by-step how-to manual, they instead just gave me their job description. And it made me feel bad because it made me think, oh gosh, do they think I'm preparing for layoffs, or do they think that I need to know what they do in case I hire a different person in their place? It just made me realize that they didn't really understand why I was asking for these cross-training manuals. So what helped was really explaining to them from the very first step, where this thinking was coming from, and that it was coming from us wanting to expand our operating hours. So I think communication like most things in life, like most things with being a manager or leading a team, communication is just so important. You can never communicate too much, and you also should never stop working on your communication, because I find it can always be improved. The next lesson was just to have patience. Uh, Everyone learns really differently. I'm the type of person where I would rather be thrown onto a desk and I will kind of muddle my way through by shadowing people, getting help. But I've learned that not everyone is like that. Some people really don't want to go anywhere near a desk and working with the public until they really have their handle on kind of how to do things. I think it comes from a fear of, they don't want to look like they don't know what they're doing. Whereas for some reason, I have no problem looking like I don't know what I'm doing. I just kind of tell people I'm new and ask them to be patient with me. Also to expect the best from your staff. I'm sort of embarrassed now that I thought they would all be against the idea of cross-training, because I thought they would find the work below them or they would feel taken advantage of. Turned out they were all really, really happy to be cross-trained because they felt it made them a better librarian and a better staff member. And it delivered better customer service, which is what they all wanted. So I think you can really enter it expecting the best from your staff instead of sort of thinking about everything that could go wrong, which is the attitude I had, unfortunately. And last, this is related to COVID, but you know what? It can be related to really any time in life. Acknowledge that it's a very difficult time for everyone. I think that during COVID, during the pandemic, has been a great time to be like, let's give everyone the benefit of the doubt, because we're all struggling with things, whether they're on screen or off screen. And what I mean by that is whether they're struggling at work or not at work, everyone was having a very difficult time. So some people will thrive with change during that, and some people won't. And both types of things are okay. You just have to learn which way works with whichever type of staff member you're working with at that time. So those were sort of my main lessons learned from cross training. That really, it worked better than I thought it would. So that was a pleasant surprise for me. So next, I would love to open it up to questions. I'm also going to put my contact information on the screen in case anyone wants to follow up with me. I think you can ask your question in the chat, or I mean, I'm fine with you guys unmuting yourself and asking the question as well, if that's easier. And if there aren't questions, I know there were some people in the beginning who said they have started cross training. There was someone on a cross training committee. If you have anything you'd like to share about your experience, whether it was similar to mine or different, I'm sure we can all learn from you. Didn't realize the sunlight would be so dappled on me when I was presenting. Okay, do your specialized staff, such as collection development or computer tech, have people who are cross-trained to do their jobs when they aren't there? That's a great question. And that is, to me, that would be the second phase in this situation, because my staff who did collection development, I could have done it for them, and when they went on vacation, I would, but just having me do it is not really a great answer to that. So something I would recommend for if you want to start with cross training with some of your more specialized staff, is to actually have like a Skillshare internal professional development meeting. So like rather than a staff meeting, or even at your staff meeting, you can ask staff to just kind of show and tell what they do in that part of their job. That would be building blocks of cross training, but what it would really do is help develop empathy. Because you know how when you start to understand, oh, this person's doing all this, like I didn't realize how much is involved in actually getting books onto our shelves. It can then make some of your other staff feel a little bit more empathetic when they feel like, people keep calling about this book and it's not available, because there's supply chain issues or whatever. So I always think it's nice to have staff share with others what they do at work. And that's good for not only for cross training, but also for building empathy. And I think it gives a nice professional development experience for the person who presents, because they may be someone who doesn't have a lot of opportunities to speak in front of others. And I think that's always a good skill that really can only be built by practicing. As far as computer tech cross training, isn't this like the age old problem that libraries have faced forever, because technology is always changing and some staff learn it along with it and some staff are a little bit more they're a little less receptive to it. So what I try to do in those situations, it's often a staff member, coming to the more like the staff member who's seen as more technological, rather than having that question just be handed off to me. I'll bring the staff member who has referred that patron to me along with me over to the computer or the copier, whatever the tech question is. So in other words, I'll be showing the patron how to do it, but at the same time, I'll be showing the staff member how to do it as well. That doesn't always solve the issue, but it helps. Also, when a staff member comes to me with a tech question, I will often ask them, well, what have you tried so far? Because if the answer is, well, I haven't tried anything, I just ran to get you, then you may want to suggest that they try a few things first and then come back if that didn't work. That's the trick that I've always used, because there have been times when people have told me the computer's not working and I walk over and the computer's just not turned on. And as a manager, that could be very frustrating. So I will often say, well, what have you tried so far? And then I think it gets the staff thinking, like, I have to try a few things before I go and ask for help. So that helps from a cross-training perspective as well. But I do think if you're just trying to lay the foundation of cross-training at your institution, you can start with a little Skillshare show and tell, where staff really start to understand better what their colleagues do. Because otherwise, some of them, they may be walking past a coworker who to them is just at their computer all day, every day, and they have no idea what that person does. Does anyone have any other questions? Well, if there's no other questions, I just want to make sure I see everything. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about our experience. I know that I will say, going back and looking through these photos and looking at what we did, it made me, first of all, I couldn't believe that that was like, at this point, gosh, a year and a half ago, right? I'm like, was it a year and a half ago? I think it was a year and a half ago. But I also just felt so proud that we made it through that experience. I mean, that first day when we came back to open for curbside, it felt a little like we were reinventing what libraries are, because we had never, curbside service, there was no way of predicting patron behavior, because lots of libraries, especially near us, they were going to reopen when we did, but they hadn't done it yet, or they only had done it for like 2 days. So we really didn't have the benefit of hearing from other people's perspectives once we started to do it. So it felt like, you know what, we can't learn from anyone here. We just have to guess, and then we have to recalibrate at the end of each day. And we would all gather kind of in like a team huddle after we closed for curbside. We all would be exhausted, having, already put in like 15,000 steps on our Fitbits. And we would talk about what had worked and what didn't. And something I loved about that is the ideas about how to improve our service were coming from all staff members. They were coming from our computer help guy. They were coming from our circulation clerks. They were coming from our reference librarians. Job descriptions really didn't matter because, we didn't have a staff member there who was hired as the coordinator of curbside service. That didn't exist. So it was like we were all suddenly on an even playing field. And in fact, I would say that the circulation clerks were really hierarchical higher than all of us because they had the most experience, most knowledge when it came to circulation, which was a lot of what curbside service entailed. So it felt like we were kind of reinventing libraries. And that's also how I took advantage of expanding the hours, because I was like, if we had to start from the ground up, day one, a new library, what would we like those operating hours to be? And the ones we chose ended up being the ones that stuck, and then just expanded on more. And the other thing we did is normally when we would expand hours, we would have done a huge publicity splash, but we actually didn't at all. We just kind of quietly expanded our hours because we actually didn't want the library to be super busy when we first reopened, because we were still learning. We were worried about staff getting ill. We were short-staffed. So we just kind of did it like a little bit under the radar, and that ended up working really well for us. So maybe at some point they'll make a huge, I keep talking like I still work there. Maybe at some point they'll make a huge publicity splash about the new hours when they're feeling really confident, and the patrons will be like, oh, I didn't know you. Lots of patrons probably still don't realize the hours have been expanded. But I'm very proud of them, and I'm very proud of the staff. I was worried staff would kind of not want to come back to work. And we did have a few part-timers who elected not to come back. But the ones who did were kind of like, can I come back tomorrow? They were so excited. I think some people were driven crazy by being at home all that time. So that was another way I was pleasantly surprised, was that we did have a lot of staff who were really eager to come back. Thank you, Mary. She said, great to hear how your library thrived. It's funny because it didn't feel like thriving at the time. It felt like just surviving. But yeah, I'm happy to look back and see how we thrived as well. That first day, it was also like, that was before we realized the COVID is not really spread through touch. So we were all changing gloves constantly, very afraid to touch anything. Doing the phone was so difficult because you didn't want to constantly be picking up a receiver that you were sharing with your colleagues. So we were using the speakerphone with gloves. It's funny. It's kind of funny to look back on now and how little we knew, and the precautions we took because we knew so little. But that was the really positive thing that came out of it, was that we did get a lot of cross training done, and we got cross training done because we had to. We had no other choice. Oh, that's a great idea. So CJ Brown said, we asked the staff what they want to be cross-trained in, and it makes them happier. That's a fantastic idea, because yeah, you're right. You'll probably have some staff who are so interested in learning a different part of the library. And it also may surprise you what they're interested in learning. I know it did me. A reference librarian who is interested in checking in the book drop is not really what I would expect, but I do believe that the more about that you understand other roles, the better you're going to be at your own role, because you'll understand just how you work in the grand universe of things, and also how you can make your colleagues' jobs a little bit easier. It leads to you being, I think, a more creative and nimble staff member. Well, if there are no other questions, thank you so much, Vicki McLean, for organizing this and introducing me and thinking of this. And thank you so much to everyone who attended. I wish you luck in your cross-training endeavors and your rebuilding after the pandemic. I know the pandemic is still going on, so it's silly to say after the pandemic, but I guess pandemic adjacent rebuilding efforts. And please send me an email or reach out if you have any other questions or want to continue the conversation. So thank you.